My name is Brynn Reynolds. I am 35 years old, and the night my family proved I was nothing but their personal bank started with one text message. I had spent weeks planning my engagement party in a private room at a waterfront restaurant in Seattle. It was the first time in my life I asked my family to show up for me instead of the other way around. I sent the invitations, paid the deposit of $20,000, and imagined them sitting around one table for once, celebrating something that was actually mine. Instead, on the afternoon of the party, my phone lit up. My sister replied to the invite with a single line, dripping with sarcasm, telling me it was such a coincidence that they were all in the Maldives and that no one would be coming. A few minutes later, my mother followed up, almost bored, explaining that the deposit I wired for the party had already been used to buy their plane tickets. There was no apology, no hesitation, just the casual announcement that my special night had been converted into their vacation. I stood there in the middle of that empty room staring at my phone while the staff finished setting places that would never be filled. Years of late-night transfers, quiet sacrifices, and swallowed insults crashed together in my head, and somehow the only word that made it out of my mouth was the one that finally ended everything. All right, before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. After that night at the waterfront restaurant, I went back to my apartment in Seattle and finally let the silence catch up with me. For most of my adult life, my family had treated my income like a public utility, something dependable and invisible that just kept everything running. I got my first real job in my early 20s, a project management position at a mid-sized tech company. While my friends were figuring out roommates and splitting rent 3 ways, I was wiring money home every month. At first it felt temporary, a bridge until things at home stabilized. They never did. My mother, Cynthia Reynolds, learned very quickly that I would say yes if she sounded desperate enough. There was always something urgent, some bill that absolutely had to be covered before the lights were shut off, or the car was taken. I covered the past due balance on her electric service more times than I can count. I paid for her internet, her cell phone, and the insurance on the aging sedan she refused to replace. Every time I told myself it would be the last time, it never was. My older sister, Adrienne Reynolds, took that pattern and turned it into a lifestyle. By the time I was paying my own rent and saving for retirement, she was bouncing between retail jobs and short-lived creative projects, staying just busy enough to call herself independent while relying on my transfers to close the gaps. When her health insurance lapsed, I added her to a policy through my employer. When her car loan fell behind, I covered 2 months in a row so it would not go into default. When she wanted to move into a more expensive apartment because it had better natural light for her content, I quietly increased the amount I sent her each month. My aunt on my mother's side picked up the habit next. She did not ask directly very often, but she did not have to. My mother framed every new request as a family emergency. A medical copay here, a shortfall on rent there, a surprise repair nobody could have predicted. Over the years, those moments blurred into a steady stream of outgoing payments that I mentally filed under the same word: necessary. Somewhere along the way, I stopped talking about money with anyone outside that circle. I did not want to admit how much of my salary disappeared into other people's budgets. When coworkers chatted about travel or home purchases, I smiled and steered the conversation away. It was easier to let them assume I was cautious than to explain that I was funding 3 adult households that were not mine. The only person who ever pushed past that surface was my fiancé, Carter Wells. We met at a volunteer event, and he liked that I was reliable. He noticed how often I checked my phone when we were out, how quickly I answered certain calls, how anxious I became whenever payday lined up with a message from my mother. He never accused, never demanded explanations, but he kept gently asking if I was doing all of this because I wanted to, or because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. I kept telling him I could handle it. I told myself that supporting them was what a good daughter and a good sister did, even as my own plans kept getting delayed. Vacations were postponed. A down payment stayed theoretical. Wedding talk stayed fuzzy and far away, like something that belonged to other people. The engagement party in Seattle was supposed to be the first thing that was undeniably mine. I chose the restaurant overlooking the water, reserved a private room, and signed for a tasting menu I never would have justified any other time. I transferred a deposit of $20,000 without breathing a word of hesitation, convincing myself that after everything I had quietly covered for them, this one night was a reasonable thing to ask. When I got home after the party that never happened, I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my banking app. For the first time in years, I did not scroll past the familiar list of transfers and withdrawals. I stared at every recurring payment and counted how many of them were keeping my family comfortable, while I kept shrinking my own life to make it possible. I saw my name attached to charges that did not even touch my life, subscriptions I never used, insurance for cars I did not drive, phone plans that lit up cities I did not live in. The list read less like a budget and more like a confession, line after line proving how far I had let them stretch my sense of obligation. Later that night, I opened my laptop and made myself look at every number on the screen as if it belonged to a stranger. I started with the smallest things, the ones that had always seemed harmless. There was a streaming service I did not remember ever using, and a music subscription I never logged into. Both were billed under my name, tied to cards I paid off each month, and neither touched my own life. Every subscription belonged to my mother or my sister. I had told myself they were gestures of support, small ways to make their days easier. Seeing them lined up in one place, I realized they were habits I had been too afraid to break. I canceled the first subscription with a few clicks. The confirmation email landed in my inbox almost immediately. I moved to the next one and did the same. With each cancellation, a quiet tension between my shoulders shifted, like I was peeling off a layer of someone else's obligations. None of this touched their basic needs. It was entertainment and convenience, things they could live without. When I reached the list of phone lines on my account, I hesitated. My own number sat at the top, then the line my mother used, then the one I added for my sister when she said she could not afford a new plan on her own. I remembered how grateful she sounded in that first call, how quickly that gratitude faded into expectation. The bill had risen with each change she requested: more data, better coverage, international options for trips I never took. I scrolled through the details, making sure there was no shared contract that would trap me in some penalty fee if I cut them off. Every line was under my responsibility. I was the one tied to the credit check, the one accountable for every overdue charge. I let myself imagine what it would look like if I stopped underwriting their emergencies and upgrades and let the cost land where it belonged. I removed the additional lines from my plan. The confirmation noted that their service would end after the current billing cycle. It was not instant or cruel. It simply meant that when the time I had already paid for ran out, so would my involvement. I moved on to insurance next. The policy that had quietly expanded to include other drivers needed to be reset. I called the company and listened as the representative walked me through the changes. I told her I would be keeping coverage only for myself. Everything else would drop off at the end of the term already paid in full. There was no drama on the other end of the line. The representative did not know the history behind my decision. She just confirmed the adjustments and read back the new premium. When the call ended, I stared at the summary of my updated policy. The list of insured names had shrunk to one: mine. Notifications began to appear before I finished. Missed calls from my mother. Texts from my sister asking why her music app would not refresh and why the streaming service no longer recognized her profile. I watched the messages stack up without opening them. For years, I had rushed to fix every inconvenience before they felt it. Now I was letting them notice what I had been absorbing. I took a breath and kept going. The automatic payments toward my mother's rent, the recurring transfer that helped cover my sister's higher-priced apartment, the money that left my account on the same day every month under vague labels we had stopped discussing long ago. I opened each one, unchecked the box that allowed it to continue, and confirmed the cancellations. I was not erasing the past payments. I was drawing a line under them. By the time I closed my banking app, my monthly obligations had been cut almost in half. The number at the bottom of the screen was not large by any extravagant standard, but it looked unfamiliar enough that I kept checking it, waiting for some hidden deduction to appear and drag it back down. Nothing happened. The new total stayed exactly where it was. Only then did I think about calling someone other than my family. I found the contact for a friend from work, a certified public accountant who had been offering for months to look over my finances if I ever wanted a second set of eyes. His name was Lucas Finch. I sent him a short message asking if he had time to talk the next day. He replied within minutes, saying he did and that I should bring everything. When I finally turned off the light and lay back on the bed, the room felt strange. I still lived in the same apartment, with the same furniture and the same view of the city. But the future no longer felt like something that only existed after everyone else's needs were met. The next morning, I met Lucas Finch at a coffee shop near my office in Seattle. He was already at a corner table when I walked in, a legal pad and calculator beside his cup. I dropped a thick folder onto the table, stuffed with bank statements, screenshots, and printouts from the night before. He opened it without comment and began to read. Lucas was a certified public accountant. As he flipped through the pages, his expression shifted from neutral to tight. He asked how long I had been sending money, who controlled which bills, and whether any of the accounts were joint. I answered each question directly. I was done decorating the truth. He started grouping the papers into piles. Insurance premiums here, recurring transfers there, rent support in another stack. On a clean sheet, he wrote down a series of monthly totals, then multiplied them out. When he slid the paper toward me, the rough figure made my throat close for a second. It was not precise, but it was enough to prove that what I had been calling help was closer to a second full-time job I worked for free. Lucas let the number sit between us and then asked if there were any major assets tied to my name that my family used. Property, loans, vehicles, anything that had required my signature. I tried to think past the usual transfers and bills. Then I remembered a rush of emails and documents from years earlier, when my mother said she was going to be forced out of the place she lived. Back then, she had found a small condominium in an older building outside the city. The bank would not approve her on her own, so she called me and said I was the only one who could make it happen. I signed the closing papers electronically between meetings at work and told myself I was co-signing her stability. I never checked how the deed was written. I never went back to the building after the first walk through. I pulled out my phone and opened the county property records site. It took a moment to remember the exact street name. When the listing finally loaded, Lucas leaned in so he could see the screen. Under owner, there was only one name: mine. All those years I had been paying the mortgage, telling myself I was helping my mother keep a roof over her head. She and my sister treated that place as their home, talking about redecorating and upgrades as if they had a right to decide everything. On paper, the only person with that right was me. Lucas stayed quiet while I absorbed it. Then he outlined what that single line meant. As the legal owner, I had authority over whether the property was occupied, rented, or sold. Any equity that had built up belonged to me. If I stopped paying, the fallout would hit my credit, but the control did not change. I asked him what it would look like to stop carrying that weight. He said that before I did anything drastic, I needed legal advice from someone who dealt with real estate and family disputes every day. He wrote a name and number on the corner of the notepad and tore it off for me. I slid the strip of paper into my folder and read it twice. Daniel Price. On my lunch break, I called the number and scheduled a consultation. The assistant on the line took down my information and the address of the condominium, then gave me a time later that week. When the day of the appointment came, I left work early and walked to the firm's office a few blocks away. I checked in at reception and sat in the waiting area with my folder on my lap, there to see what it would take to step back. Daniel Price greeted me and led me into a conference room. I spread the key documents across the table: property records, mortgage statements, and a summary of the support I had been providing. He read in silence, then explained my position in plain terms. The deed listed me as the sole owner of the condominium. My mother and sister had been living there because I allowed it, not because the law gave them any claim. As long as I followed the rules for notice and timing, I could decide what happened next. He laid out my options. I could sell the property and remove myself from the mortgage entirely. I could set a formal lease at market rate and stop pretending the payments were favors. If they refused to cooperate, there were legal steps to require them to leave. For the first time in a long time, I was hearing what my life might look like if I stopped letting guilt write all the contracts. In the days that followed, those options stopped being theoretical and turned into decisions I made. I began by putting everything in writing. On my laptop, I drafted a message to my mother and my sister, stating that I would no longer cover their monthly expenses and that the condominium they treated as theirs was legally mine. If they wanted to stay, they would need a written lease at market rate starting in the coming months, with rent due on the same date every time. If they chose not to sign, I would list the property for sale and step away from the mortgage once it closed. Before I hit send, I read the email out loud. It sounded cold, but it was clear. There were no apologies, no explanations, just dates and decisions. I sent it and watched it leave my outbox. Their reaction arrived faster than any transfer ever had. My phone lit up with calls, then with messages stacked on top of one another. I let the calls go to voicemail. Answering in the middle of that rush had never changed anything before, so I waited until the notifications slowed and opened the first thread. My mother wrote that I was abandoning her, that she could not afford rent without my income, that family did not treat each other like strangers. She did not mention the Maldives or the engagement party. In her story, none of that existed. This was me turning my back on her for no good reason. The next message came from my sister. Adrienne insisted the condominium existed because of all the sacrifices they made when I was younger. In her version of our history, I owed them this home and the money that kept it running. She called my decision petty and dramatic, said I was choosing my fiancé over my own blood, and warned that I was destroying the family over one party. I read both messages once, archived the threads, and turned back to the list of payments. The small changes showed up first. When the streaming cycle renewed, my sister's shows stopped loading. The music subscription I had canceled no longer refreshed her playlists. The extra lines on my phone plan reached the end of the paid period and went dark. The revised insurance policy renewed with only my name on it, and the premium dropped. Each change landed quietly, exactly the way the confirmation screens had promised. At the end of the month, the mortgage payment for the condominium posted as it always had. The amount leaving my account was the same, but it no longer felt like proof that I would shoulder this forever. It was one more payment on a timeline that finally had an end point. With Daniel's help, I had set a specific date for the new terms to begin, far enough away to be fair, close enough that no one could pretend they had endless time. My mother tried to stretch that date the moment she realized I was serious. She wrote again asking for an extension, then another. She said she needed more time, that she was too old to start somewhere new, that I should think about everything she had done for me. Her words followed the same pattern I had heard my entire life, leaning on guilt when nothing else would. I answered once, briefly, confirming that the dates in my first message still stood. I did not explain or apologize. After that, I stopped responding. I kept every new message in the same folder as my financial records and did not send a single line in return. As the deadline approached, the tone of the messages shifted. The blame softened into panic. Adrienne stopped accusing and started suggesting alternatives that all sounded like different ways to keep me on the hook. Partial support, temporary arrangements, new schedules that still depended on my salary. My own days did not pause for any of it. I went to work, sat in meetings that had nothing to do with my family, and came home to an apartment that finally felt like a place I lived instead of a layover between obligations. When my salary hit my account, the balance stayed long enough for me to look at it. Instead of disappearing into other people's emergencies, it waited for me to decide what to do with it. On the night before the new terms were set to start, I printed the email I had sent and placed it at the front of the folder that held my records. The stack of paper looked ordinary on my kitchen table, but it marked the moment I stopped being a background source of money and started being the person in charge of my own. A few days after the deadline in my message passed, something landed on my phone that cut through all the noise. My cousin, Elise Reynolds, sent me a short note asking if I had a minute, and then dropped a link to a social media post. She rarely involved herself in anything between me, my mother, and my sister. The link led to a photograph of my mother and my sister standing in front of bright water and white sand. They were smiling, holding drinks, dressed for a vacation I had never heard them mention before the engagement party. The caption called it a much-needed family escape to the Maldives. Elise wrote that there were more. I swiped through pictures of them on decks and terraces and in front of a resort entrance. In one frame, my aunt was visible behind them, laughing with a glass in her hand. The comments were full of people telling them how happy they looked. What was missing said more than anything in the frame. There was no mention of my engagement party in Seattle, no hint that the deposit for that night had been converted into plane tickets and hotel rooms. Elise added one more line. When she asked why I was not in any of the photos, my mother told her that I had changed my mind about the party and that they were not going to let my mood ruin their plans. That was the story traveling through the family while the staff at the restaurant cleared away untouched place settings. I took screenshots of every post and dropped them into the folder where I kept my statements and emails. Those pictures did not change any legal document, but they stripped away the last story I had been telling myself. This was not confusion. They had chosen to spend my money on their vacation and then rewritten the narrative so they could enjoy it. That afternoon, I called Daniel Price and told him everything. I described the condominium in my name, the years of payments that kept it afloat, the message I had sent about new terms, and the images from the Maldives. When I finished, he did not talk about hurt feelings. He asked what I wanted to happen now. The answer was simple. I wanted to stop carrying them. I wanted the place that existed because of my work to either support my future or leave my life entirely. Daniel said the property records and payment history already gave us what we needed. As the owner, I could decide under what conditions anyone stayed there. He recommended we set those conditions out in a formal notice that could stand in a file, not just in a text thread. He drafted a letter that laid out the facts in plain language. The condominium belonged to me. If my mother and my sister wanted to remain there, they would need to sign a written lease at a fair market rate and start paying on a specific date. If they refused, I would either list the property for sale or move to recover possession through the court. We went through the text together. There was no dramatic language, only dates, amounts, and consequences. At the end, he added one sentence directing any questions about the property to his office from that point forward. I agreed and authorized him to send it. The letter went out by certified mail, A copy arrived in my mailbox along with the receipt showing that someone at the building had signed for it. I held the duplicate at my kitchen table and realized it was the first document in years that required something from them instead of more from me. Their reactions arrived the way I expected. My mother filled my screen with messages saying lawyers were for strangers, that I was embarrassing her, that people would talk. My sister sent notes accusing me of choosing money over family and warning that I would regret this. Neither message mentioned the Maldives or the photographs. Neither offered to sign a lease or pay rent. I did not answer. I forwarded each new message to Daniel and saved it with the rest of my records. If they wanted to argue now, they would be arguing with a process, not with the person they had trained to feel guilty. When my aunt, Nadine Reynolds, finally weighed in, it was with a long email about sacrifice and obligation. She said family did not send formal notices and that I owed more than I could ever repay. I read it once and filed it beside the screenshots from the trip. On paper, nothing about the facts had changed. I still owned the condominium. They were still living in it. The difference was that I had stopped stepping in to protect them from the outcomes tied to their own choices. Several months passed. The letter from Daniel faded into the background, but its deadline did not. The time he gave my mother and my sister to sign a lease or leave came and went. They did not pay rent, did not agree to any terms, and kept sending messages about how I was hurting them. When the date finally expired, Daniel filed to take the condominium back. The court hearing was short. I sat at a table, handed over the deed and the mortgage records, and answered simple questions. Every paper showed that the place was in my name and that I had been making the payments. There was nothing that turned my support into a lifetime promise. In the order the judge signed, there were no speeches about family, only a clear move-out date and a warning about what would happen if they ignored it. Their reactions landed in my inbox almost immediately. My mother wrote that she had nowhere to go and that I was abandoning her. My sister claimed I was throwing her out over one misunderstanding. My aunt said I was tearing the family apart to impress my fiancé and to look powerful. None of them mentioned the Maldives. None of them mentioned the night in Seattle when they chose a beach over my engagement party. I did not respond. I forwarded a few of the messages to Daniel so he could see what they were saying, then put my phone away. On the day they were required to leave, I was at my desk in the office, going through project notes while somewhere else a property manager walked through rooms that no longer belonged to them. I did not ask for photos. Knowing that the keys were no longer in their hands was enough. Once the unit was empty, Daniel and I agreed to sell. The neighborhood had grown more popular since my mother first pushed me to sign the loan. The offer we accepted covered what was left on the mortgage and left a real amount for me. Signing the sale documents did not feel like revenge. It felt like closing a chapter I had been paying for alone. I used part of the money to clear the last of my personal debt. The rest became a down payment on a small place in Seattle that belonged to me and to Carter. We chose a simple 2-bedroom apartment with old wood floors and a narrow balcony that caught the afternoon light. The lease had just our names on it. No extra lines, no hidden obligations. My mother, my sister, and my aunt had to figure out their own housing. Through a lease, I heard that they moved between short-term rentals and spare rooms while they learned how to qualify on their own. Landlords asked for deposits and proof of income. Utility companies wanted their names on the accounts. It was not kind or cruel. It was just how life worked when my paycheck was no longer holding everything together for them. Elise forwarded one more message my mother sent to a group of relatives. In it, my mother said I had taken her home away and that I would end up alone. Elise added a single line saying she did not agree, but thought I should see it. I thanked her and filed the email with the rest of my records. I did not send a long explanation to the family. People who wanted to know what really happened already knew how to reach me. Life after that looked ordinary from the outside, which was exactly what I needed. My paycheck stayed in my account long enough for me to plan more than a month ahead. Carter and I talked about trips we might actually take, not about vacations other people booked with money I earned. We built an emergency fund and watched it grow without wondering which relative would ask for it next. Sometimes my mind goes back to that private room at the waterfront restaurant in Seattle. For a long time, that empty night felt like proof that my family never really saw me. Now I see it as a line across my life. On one side is the woman who believed love meant paying for everyone else and hoping they would finally treat her like she mattered. On the other side is the woman who understands that belonging to a family does not mean living as their backup plan. If any part of this feels familiar, I hope you hear this clearly. You are allowed to step back from people who treat your effort like a right instead of a gift. You are allowed to set boundaries without turning into the villain in their version of the story. Saying no does not erase everything you have given. It gives you a chance to build a life that is not held together by constant sacrifice. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story made you think about your own boundaries or the way you show up for the people around you, I hope you take a moment after this video to ask what kind of family you are building and whether you are really part of it too.